Am I the jerk for wasting my youth on parties and nightlife? I'm 32. Last night I was sitting in a dark room, lit only by the glow of my phone screen. On the screen was a photo. Me, Dan, Amber, and Tony. We were at a club, laughing. Someone was holding a champagne bottle. Someone else had a cocktail with an umbrella. That was exactly 10 years ago. Back then I thought that moment was the peak of my life. But now looking at the picture, all I see are empty eyes and the cheap gloss of fake happiness. There was a time I believed partying was more than just fun. It was a lifestyle. Every evening starting from Thursday, we'd leave work and dive into the game. We even had our own rules. Whoever suggested going home first had to pay for all the drinks the next Friday. Nobody ever wanted to lose. Every Friday started the same way. We'd meet at Amber's place. She was always the organizer. The one who knew all the bartenders, all the DJs, and everyone at the party. Her knowledge of the city's nightlife made us feel like royalty. We could walk into any club and always find a spot. We thought it would last forever. But one moment stands out in my memory. One night we went to a newly opened club. It was the night Tony, our main joker, suddenly didn't seem like himself. He sat in the corner, drinking something non-alcoholic, watching us like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Later, as we were leaving, he said quietly to me, "You ever think we do all this because we're scared to be alone, Jake?" I brushed it off at the time. It was Tony. He was always joking. A few months later, Tony was gone. He left our group chat, stopped answering calls. We found out he'd moved to another city and taken an office job. Amber said he just gave up. Dan suggested we forget about him, but it bothered me. Why did he leave without a word? Why didn't he say he was uncomfortable? Or maybe I just wasn't listening. After Tony left, something in our group started to break. Amber, despite her vibrant personality, began disappearing more often on weekends. Dan joked that she must have found a boyfriend who hated parties. I laughed along, but deep down, I felt there was more to it. She stopped posting stories about our adventures and started sharing photos of books, exhibitions, and quiet evenings with a glass of wine. One day I ran into her at a cafe by chance. Amber was sitting by the window, immersed in a book, looking so calm I barely recognized her. I didn't want to approach her, but she noticed me and smiled. "Jake, have a seat," she said. We talked like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, though it had only been a couple of months. She told me she'd met someone. He was quiet, passionate about art, and the complete opposite of everyone she dated before. "You know, I don't want to waste time on meaningless nights anymore," she said suddenly. "I need something real." Her words hit me hard. I felt like a kid left on the playground while everyone else had gone home. But the strangest thing happened a few weeks later. Dan, our constant partner in adventures, suggested meeting at a bar we hadn't been to in a long time. When I arrived, he was already at the counter with a glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked tired, almost worn out. "Jake, I've been thinking," he started but trailed off. "About what?" I asked. "Maybe it's time to quit." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but he wasn't laughing. "Quit what?" I asked, still doubting the seriousness of his tone. "All of this. Parties, drinking, wasting life away." I was stunned. This was Dan, the guy who once suggested climbing onto the roof of an old building just for the view. The one who laughed the loudest and always knew the best places to spend the night. "Are you kidding?" I searched his face for a hint of humor, but it wasn't there. He just sighed heavily. "I'm opening a bar," he said. "I've got a loan and a ton of fears, but I can't live like this anymore." The news hit me like a punch. Am I the only one not seeing that everything is changing? Or am I just too scared to admit it? That night I came home earlier than usual. Dan's and Amber's words kept replaying in my mind. For the first time in a long while, I began asking myself the questions I'd been running from. Why am I still holding on to this? Why am I clinging to a lifestyle that doesn't seem to make me happy anymore? After that conversation with Dan, I started noticing things that had slipped past me before. Parties no longer brought the same joy they used to. The music felt too loud, and the conversations around me seemed hollow. I couldn't figure out if something had changed in the atmosphere or just within me, but I kept going anyway. Friday nights with new, barely familiar people became a habit. It was easier with them. No need to explain what you're feeling or who you really are. But one day, I woke up with a terrible hangover and vague memories of the previous night and suddenly realized I couldn't even remember their names. The following week, Dan invited me to the opening of his bar. I went out of curiosity, wanting to see what he'd created. The bar was nothing like the places we used to hang out in. No deafening bass, no heaving crowds. It was simple, almost cozy. What do you think? Dan asked, handing me a glass of something non-alcoholic. It's different, I admitted. We started talking. I told him about my nights, trying to recapture the lightness that used to be ours. But Dan just nodded silently. Then he looked at me and said, Jake, have you ever thought about what you'd be doing if you weren't partying? That question struck a chord. I didn't even know how to respond. What would I be doing? I'd never thought about it. My life had always been ruled by spontaneity, and I thought that was freedom. Have you tried anything new? He continued. Something not tied to parties? I mumbled something vague, but inside, it set something in motion. Maybe I really was stuck. A few days later, I stumbled upon an old photo. It was from my college graduation. My parents were in it, smiling proudly. Back then, I dreamed of a different life, a career, travel, maybe even a family. But somehow, those dreams had gotten lost. That evening, I signed up for a cooking class. It was a spontaneous, almost impulsive decision. I'd never taken cooking seriously, but I wanted to try something new. The first class was pure chaos. I cut my finger, dropped a bowl of dough, and burned the sauce. But to my surprise, I didn't feel stupid. On the contrary, I enjoyed it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something not for others, but for myself. Weeks went by. I started cooking at home, inviting friends to try my dishes. I even invited Amber. She came over, and we talked for hours. I see you're changing, she said. It's good to see. But the real test came when I ran into Jess again. We bumped into each other by chance in a bookstore. She was the girl I'd met at a club once, but never followed up with. Jake? She said, surprised. Yeah, it's me. We went for coffee, and I told her everything I'd been going through. This time I wasn't talking about parties, but about my attempts to make a change. Interesting, she said with a smile. Let's see how serious you are. Her words felt like a challenge. After the meeting with Jess, I realized that changing yourself isn't just about quitting parties. It goes much deeper. It meant stepping out of my comfort zone, acknowledging my mistakes, letting the past go, and finding what truly brings joy. I started asking myself questions I had avoided before. Why was I so attached to parties? Was it fear of being alone? Or just a convenient habit? The answers didn't come right away, but I felt that something had shifted. Jess became an important part of this process. She didn't tell me what to do, but her skepticism pushed me forward. She supported me but didn't let me get too comfortable. One evening, Jess asked, "What about your old friends? Do you still keep in touch with them?" I paused to think. I'd seen Dan at his bar, and he seemed happy, completely immersed in his work. Amber had come over for dinner, and we talked, but our meetings had become rare. With Tony, it was different. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, and it left me with an odd sense of unease. I decided it was time to fix that. Firstly, I called Amber. She didn't answer right away, but when we started talking, I realized she missed me too. She told me about her new passion, photography, and invited me to an exhibition. Reconnecting with Tony was harder. I sent him a message but didn't get a reply. So, I decided to call, and to my surprise, he picked up. "Jake, I wasn't expecting to hear from you," he said. We agreed to meet. He still smiled the same way, but there was something new in his eyes, a calmness I'd never seen before. He told me he left our group because he felt like he was losing himself. "Did you ever notice we were all just running from something?" he asked. I remembered that night when he first talked about the fear of being alone. Now I understood what he meant. Seeing Dan was easier. His bar was thriving, and he was happy to see me. We sat at the counter just like we used to, but it felt different now. I could see he'd found his place, and that inspired me. I still go to parties occasionally, but they're no longer the center of my life. I've learned to find joy in simpler things. Cooking dinner for friends, walking in the park, reading books. Jess and I have grown closer. She saw my efforts and respected them. One day she said, "You seem real now." Those words meant more to me than I could have imagined. It's been a year since I decided to make a change. Sometimes I wonder, what if I'd started earlier? Could I have achieved more? Maybe. But on the other hand, all those years were my lesson. What do you think? Is it worth regretting the way we spent our youth? Or is it just part of the path that shapes us? Share your thoughts in the comments below.